You're welcome to sit in, by the way. Just don't criticize his answers.
I better not sit in.
That's right.
I don't criticize, I would amplify.
Amplify? Well, if you feel a tremendous need to amplify, we'll talk to you at the end. Let me first of all double check the spelling of your last name, sir. Is it
Gibian.
And you go by Marvin?
Yes.
M-A-R-V-I-N.
Right.
What is your date of birth?
10/5/27.
No, everything is perfect.
And you were born where?
I
Here.
was born 4105 Montgomery in Kansas City, Missouri.
It's short for Charles.
What's your last name?
Titus, T-I-T-U-S.
Lived in the Kansas City area all
Yes,
his
sir.
life.
So when I was in the Navy.
My name,
Okay.
Titus, T-I-T-U-S.
I will
my
read a
mom,
little script here at the start, and then
she's not civil con.
we'll get going on our conversation.
And I think she's the driving force.
Chaz, are we ready?
Yes, sir.
Welcome to another interview for the Kansas City Garment Industry Project. Today is January 14th, 2011. I'm John Dvorak, and I'm interviewing Marvin Gibian, whose family was the owner of a long-time sportswear business in Kansas City. The videographer is Chaz Titus. Marvin, the selling of sportswear, I guess, must have been one of your earliest memories in life.
Well, it wasn't exactly sportswear. It was men's and boys' furnishings. Jackets, slacks, shirts, as compared to sportswear as you may know it to be.
What did you call it? Not sports.
Wholesale men's and boys' wear.
I see. What were some of your early memories?
Traveling with my dad in the summer on occasion when he went out on road trips, I would go with him and sit in the car while he called on customers, or go and have hot roast beef sandwiches with mashed potatoes and gravy.
That sounds like a nice memory. The roast beef sandwich is part of it. Tell me how all of this began. Now, your father came here from Russia?
My father was born 1884. He came to the United States at the age of 16 by himself, although a brother and a sister had preceded him. His brother in Chicago, a sister in Kansas City. He was the youngest of about 8 or 9 siblings, and the deal at that time was to get out of Russia or you would be conscripted in the Russian army for 25 years. So he came to the States for about the first 6 or 9 months of his life here. He lived with his brother Abe in Chicago and went to night school to learn English. He then moved to Kansas City because his sister, Esther Rothenberg, was already here, settled with a family. So he, I don't know the circumstances that precipitated him moving here, but that's what he did. And that was about, well, he came here in 1900 and he wasn't in Chicago more than a year, so he probably came here in about 1901, 1902. And met my mother, and they were married in 1911. Next month would be their 100th wedding anniversary, February the 2nd, 1911. He, I don't know what he did, because he never shared those things with me in those early years, but he was always in the apparel business, men's apparel business, in the wholesale end of it. He worked for a firm, I think it was known as H. Levy and Company, which is one of the several men's wholesalers on Broadway. There were numerous of them. I'd be glad to share the names with you if you want. He worked there until January 1st, 1927, when he and a man by the name of I.W. Jarrus, J-A-R-U-S, opened a wholesale house known as Jarrus and Gibian at 804 Broadway. And they stayed in business until through the Depression and until about, I think, 1938 or 1939, when they dissolved the business. Became too one-sided. My dad was doing all the work and Jarrus was playing bridge. That's the story I heard. He was an expert. He was a contract bridge player. At that time, my dad took over the business. Jarrus and Gibian obviously was not a name that he wanted to pursue because Jarrus was out of it. Jarrus eventually went into, I think, the women's dress business, also in Kansas City. But my dad had a vendor in Columbus, Mississippi, known as the Seminole Manufacturing Company. And I'll take that back. They came from Seminole, Oklahoma, to Columbus, Mississippi. They manufactured pants, and at that time, my dad went down there to negotiate to buy some merchandise, and he needed a label, and they had an unused label which was Oakwood. So he adapted that and it became Oakwood Sportswear. That's how the name came about.
Was Oakwood 2 words or one?
No, 1 word. Oakwood Sportswear.
So when your father came to the United States, he did not come with skills because he was still a
He was 16 years old and he didn't speak English.
Do you know what his interest in the apparel business was?
I think at that time, I think a lot of the Jewish immigrants had migrated to the apparel business, and I don't know the circumstances, but that's where he ended up.
He was just sort of reacting to the community, you think?
I would think so, yes, and maybe some advice given to him by someone else. I don't know.
What skills did he have that made him good in the apparel business, do you think?
He was a schmoozer. My dad was a good talker. He made friends in the business, customers, readily, and they liked him.
We've talked about your dad, but we didn't, I don't think, say his name.
Ben Gibian. Actually, it was Benjamin Gibian, but it was Ben Gibian. The family name in Europe was Gibianski, spelled with an S-K-I.
Now, when did you begin thinking of going into the business?
Oh, I was never particularly a student, and after about 2 years of college, 1 year at junior college in Kansas City and 1 year at KCU, which is now UMKC, I decided that wasn't for me, and actually about in 1948, right before my wife and I were married, I sort of joined the business. That's after I came home from the Navy and did a year at UMKC.
Now by then, Jarrus was gone.
Yeah, he was out of the picture, yeah.
And it was Oakwood.
Yes.
About when did it become Oakwood?
That was probably in 38 or 39.
Now, had the business been successful in the 30s, do you know?
Actually, it was fairly successful considering that there was a depression. At that time, the method of distribution, so to speak, from the manufacturer to the retailer went through the wholesaler, because the manufacturers in the East did not have the wherewithal or the ability to go out and call on the mom and pop stores, which was basically the bread and butter of the wholesalers, at least in the Kansas City area. And so at that time, the wholesaler bought merchandise from the manufacturer and then resold it to the retailer, who then resold it to the consumer. And that was basically, as I said, because the manufacturers could not, they couldn't afford to go out in the sticks and go to Wewoka, Oklahoma, and Seminole, Oklahoma, and Pauls Valley, and Coffeyville, and all those little towns to distribute.
So that was the business model for your father in the 30s then, to go around to these smaller.
Yeah,
cities?
he traveled basically in a pattern going north and south on both sides of the state line of Missouri and Kansas, down into Oklahoma, various parts of Oklahoma, and a little bit of the Oklahoma Panhandle, and a little bit of a few cities in western Texas, such as Lubbock and Wichita Falls.
Now, he would have been totally independent, and so setting the territory was his decision then, I take it.
Yes, yeah, you went with what they say about the bank robbers. Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. He went. They sought out primarily the little mom and pop stores, clothing stores, in the small towns were 95% Jewish owned at that time.
All over the territory?
Most of the territory, yeah, that's correct. And so that was sort of an entree to calling on them, because you had something in common with them.
Tell us what he would have sold in the 30s.
He sold men's pants, work shirts, t-shirts, sport shirts, jackets, leather jackets and cloth jackets, primarily.
No hats or
No,
overcoats
no.
or shoes? Or
No. Nothing in that was called, I think, the haberdashery line. No, nothing like that.
Where did he get those products?
Well, one was the manufacturer in Columbus, Mississippi that he went to, who was a big pant manufacturer, who supplied him with merchandise. There were various manufacturers throughout the East. There was a manufacturer, a leather jacket manufacturer in St. Louis, who was a very substantial supplier of merchandise to my dad, and then there were many manufacturers, clothing manufacturers in the East, looking for distribution through wholesalers. So that's how that all came about.
So he didn't concentrate on just one or two manufacturers. He had a pretty large
He had
number.
somebody who manufactured, he bought shirts from, somebody who bought pants from, somebody who he bought jackets from. Depending. Most of those manufacturers probably had one product, one that they really emphasized on.
What quality were these products?
They were working class quality products. It wasn't a Wolf Brothers, and it wasn't a Nordstrom, so to speak. It was the working man would come in and in a little store and buy what he needed to do whatever his chores were.
Did he sell any products that were manufactured in the Kansas City area?
No.
Why not?
There were manufacturers in the Kansas City area primarily of women's wear, not of men's wear. And that's why. There were a lot of women's suit and coat manufacturers here, women's dress manufacturers here was a center for that, but nothing, there was no one here who manufactured leather jackets or slacks or sport shirts or anything like that.
Some of the companies, at least, that were manufacturing here in Kansas City also went out and did their own selling. They had a sales force, which is a different model than what you're describing.
They did. Primarily I think the women's suit and coat garment industry had their own salesmen out in calling on various areas of the country.
Do you know, in the 30s, did your father relate to the manufacturers here in Kansas City at all? Were they kind of a large
The only way
industry?
the only way you related, because 95% of them were Jewish, so they all had something in common, and they were all within the same 2 or 3 block area between 8th and 10th on Broadway, in that general area. So you'd see somebody at lunch sometimes, or you'd see somebody at a religious service. I mean, that's what brought them together. I mean, they weren't necessarily socially friendly. They were not unfriendly. They just weren't socially friendly.
They knew each other, but
they knew each other. That's correct.
You would not describe them as a tight club or anything like that.
No. Don't forget, at least in the menswear part of it, they were sort of basically competitive. You mean the wholesalers in the menswear here, of which I have a list here of them, they were friendly competitors, because a lot of them, they called on the same customers.
Were they real friendly or just partly friendly?
I would say they were partly friendly. Yeah, there was no animosity. They just went their own way. That's all.
It was a collegial group, though.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's correct.
Not a cutthroat.
No
situation.
No.
The Kansas City garment manufacturers were pretty successful down through the years, and certainly they were in the 30s. Would you describe your father's business as pretty successful too, at that time?
As I said before, my father, and during the 30s when he was in a partnership with I.W. Jarris, they always made a living. There was always ample food on our table. My mother had a car, a 1933 Buick that I remember. And my father then had a smaller car that he used to travel on the road. So we lived in a home, which at that time there were a lot of people, I think, who lived in apartments and rented. My parents always owned the home they lived in, which was 4105 Montgall.
He did well.
He didn't do well. He did okay.
He did okay.
Yeah.
Now you say
he made a living.
You say he was located at 8th and Broadway at that time?
Mm-hmm.
What was the address? Do you remember?
This is 804, 806 Broadway.
Well, what happened in World War II? Did the business change?
Business skyrocketed.
Really?
In World War II, yeah, because there was a demand for merchandise. People, we went from unemployment in the 30s and bread lines and guys selling apples on the street corners to full employment in war factories, and that produced spendable income. And business was very good during the war years.
Was he able to get his products okay?
Yes. Yes, he was.
And what year do you recall did it become Oakwood?
Well, I said I think in either 38 or 39.
Just before the war?
Yeah, yes, that was before the war, yeah.
And then you came into the picture right after the war?
Well, I went in the Navy in the early part of 1945 and came out in 1946, and went to Kansas City University for a year or so, and then met Evelyn, and that was about we got married in January of 1949, and I had made actually a trip with my dad previous to that in October of 1948.
To New York to buy.
No, Evelyn, please.
Where did you go on that first trip?
We went to Tulsa, where it was we had a sample room. At that time you opened a sample room in a hotel and invited customers in the area to come in and see your samples and place orders.
So you didn't always go to an individual store then? You might have the stores come to you.
At that instance, the stores came to you, but generally you went to the stores.
Tell me how that would work in the hotel. There weren't Holiday Inns or
There were
anything.
sample rooms.
You just rent a room?
You
or-
rented a large room, and there's usually a couple of racks in there to hang your samples on, and a bed, and a bathroom, and it was a sleeping room and a sample room. Those were readily available in hotels at that time.
And then you invited the stores that were your clients to come
That's correct.
and visit you.
Hmm.
And then you would hopefully get orders and
That's right. That was the name of the game.
take orders.
Hmm.
Did you have concerns about going into family business, or did you like it? Were your memories of it good from your
I
youth?
really didn't know much else. I didn't have any concerns about it. My dad was in the business, and my father was 44, I believe, when I was born. So by the time I was 15 or 16, he was already almost 60 or over. So he didn't have anyone else. He had some son-in-laws who were not involved in the business at all. So I sort of just by natural movement, I ended up with him.
But did you like the business at that point in time?
Yeah, I did.
Did you think of doing something else, or were you always thinking about this?
No, I think at that time I was satisfied in the garment business with my dad.
So you two worked together then for a while?
Yes, from 1949 until 1964.
Oh, you worked together that entire period?
Yes.
How was it working with your dad?
Up and down. Last few years were terrible.
I meant more on a personal...
That's what I said. Up and down, the last few years were terrible.
Well, let's start off with the 50s, which were hopefully decent years. How was the business after World War II? As the country recovered from the war, what changed about the business? How did the business go?
The business went, there were some fluctuations. We had following the war, there was a downfall, somewhat of not a depression, but a recession between, let's say, 46 and 48 or 49. Business fell off. It was still manageable, but not to the extent that it was during the war. And then in 1950, things picked up again because of the Korean incident. And that created a stimulus because merchants panicked, and they thought that there was not going to be any merchandise available, and there was a lot of buying at that time. That was a stimulus to the business, to all these wholesale businesses. If one did well, the others did well. If none of them did, none of them did very well. And that stayed on for several years, as long as there was the Korean conflict. After that time, business leveled off, and you began to see a change in the whole structure. The mom and pop stores were disappearing. By either they were all dying off, or they just succumbed to competition. And the thing that the greatest impact was the box stores, the Walmarts. When the Walmarts started opening up, people didn't have to go to the little store and buy a pair of socks or a sports shirt. They went to Walmart, and Walmart, not conquered, but took over a good deal of the market. And so Walmart didn't need a wholesaler. Walmart bought from the same people, the same manufacturers that Oakwood Sportswear bought from. So there was no middleman profit to consider at that point. So competitively, the wholesaler was at a disadvantage because of at that time, the retailers, the manufacturers were calling on the remaining retail outlets themselves, in addition to Walmart in the market.
Well, as the 50s began and you were in the business, were you still following the same model in that you traveled around a certain territory and sold to the smaller stores?
I did at that time, but we had some other outlets for our merchandise too in Kansas City. See, you had 3 large mail order houses in Kansas City: Sears Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, and a lesser known one, National Bellis Hess in North Kansas City. And they consumed a lot of merchandise because their catalogs would go out and sometimes they would not be able to foresee their needs. So they would come to the local markets and buy merchandise that they could have readily available, could have in their warehouses the following day, literally. So that was an outlet, and those stores, I mean those organizations, provided quite a bit of business to all of the wholesalers in Kansas City at that time.
So some of the products you sold would have gone all over the United States and perhaps even beyond through those.
Well, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, you don't care where they go after you want to ship them to them. They do whatever.
But through those mail order houses.
Yeah, through those mail order houses. And in addition to that, they had numerous retail stores. You know, Sears Roebuck had a large retail store at one time on the plaza, which you probably remember. Well, we were able to off and on occasion sell them merchandise, promotional merchandise. Montgomery Ward had a basement operation out on St. John and Belmont, and they used merchandise there, low-end merchandise. National Bellis Hess just bought merchandise to fill in for their catalog needs. They didn't have any retail outlets in Kansas City. They had one man there who sold surplus merchandise for them, but that had nothing to do with it. The entree to the mail order houses enabled us to call on some of the Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck retail stores in Memphis, in Dallas, there was one in Greensboro, North Carolina, but that was mail order. Minneapolis, Montgomery Ward in Chicago. They used certain amounts of merchandise to fill in to cover their catalog needs.
So in the 50s, what states would you travel to regularly to?
I would travel to parts of Missouri, parts of Kansas, parts of Oklahoma, and a little bit of western part of Texas.
And then would you occasionally get to some of those other cities that you just mentioned, like Minneapolis or?
No, my dad usually did most of that. He had the entree to those places.
Is that about as far afield as the company stretched
Yes.
at that time?
Yes.
How big was the company after the war? How many employees did you have?
We had my father, myself, a bookkeeper, and a shipping clerk.
That was it?
That's it.
Well, you guys worked hard then, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. I used to sell and pack.
What do you mean?
Well, I'd go out and sell merchandise, and sometimes I'd come back in and pack it, pack it up to.
So you did practically everything.
I remember as a teenager going down and helping my dad out after school, filling orders.
Now, were there a lot of companies in Kansas City that did this type of thing?
Yes.
At that time?
Mm-hmm. There was the Fitz Dry Goods Company, H.D. Poindexter, Kalis and Alport, H. Levy, Company, who my dad worked for, Textile Distributors, which was previously Hibbs Furnishing Goods Company, and an outfit known as Allied Clothers and Jobbers, and they were really they were a buying syndicate for a group of stores in northern Missouri and Iowa and Nebraska, and a company known as Herman Weil Company. They all did the same thing.
They all operated in roughly the same fashion?
Mm-hmm. We were probably the smallest of any of them.
I was going to ask what size you were by comparison.
We were the smallest.
You were not a terribly large company
No,
then.
we were not.
Well, how did things go in the 50s? You began to see some problems with the,
Yes.
the
Toward the
loss
end,
of the...
toward the end of the 50s, we saw the competition was growing stronger because of our markets were diminishing. The stores that we used to call on were no longer there. And sometimes you could replace them, sometimes you couldn't. So if your markets diminish, you've either got to go out and find something else or suffer with it. So we did a little of both. We relied somewhat on the fill-in merchandising with the mail order houses, Sears and Monkey and National, and then hopefully selling to some of their retail outlets, such as I said, Sears on the Plaza and Sears in Dallas.
At this time, were you still buying all of your goods domestically?
Yes.
There was little or no foreign made?
No, I take that back. No, we did buy, there was foreign made merchandise, yes, there was. Mm-hmm.
But primarily, it would have been domestic?
Primarily it was still domestic, yeah.
What were your feelings when you began to see that foreign made merchandise come in? Did you have any hint of what would ultimately happen?
Yeah, I knew it was going to fold up. I knew it was, but I stayed there primarily to help my dad out. I knew that there was going to be a demise. All of these names that I read to you, they're all out of business. They all went out of business.
All for the same reason?
I don't know. I can't account for that, but I know they were all gone.
But they were all losing the small mom and pop
That's right.
stores, and they were all beginning to fall victim to the manufacturer dealing directly with the
retailers.
the big store.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
What year approximately would you say you began to see real trouble? Was it in the 50s or was it even into the 60s?
It was probably about 1960, I'd say. Late 50s, 1960. Mm-hmm.
What did you think about it at that time? What was going through your mind?
I was going through my mind is what I was going to do. I had given some thought to. I had been approached by a retail group in Kansas City to come with them, but I knew that my dad would. I wanted my dad really to close the business at one time. I wanted him to, but he would not do that. Mainly because my mother thought it was insane. And I knew that if I left, he would just sort of...
Lose the business.
Well, not lose it, but just it would sort of crumble around him, so to speak.
He was pretty old by then, wasn't he?
My father was 80 in 1964 when he died, so in 1960 he was already 75 years old, yes.
You didn't want to just abandon him.
That's right.
At that point in his
That's
life.
right. And my mother would not listen to any reason as to, let's get out of this and, let's take our whatever pound of flesh we have and get out, and because she didn't want my dad hanging around the house all day.
So this was the down period that you referenced earlier?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How difficult was it?
Wasn't easy. Wasn't easy. But we managed.
Is it painful to look back at those
Not
years?
necessarily painful. It just I just wish maybe that they had listened a little more and closed the business.
It wasn't really that he or you guys did anything wrong, was it? It was just
No,
the
so
environment and the
we were
time.
victim of the environment and victim of the times. That's correct.
Was there anything, as you look back on it, that could have been done to change the business model, for example, to preserve the business for a while?
My dad was too old, and I don't think that I had the foresight at that time to even consider what to change it to tell you the truth. The only options would have been possibly to go more retail. I mean, actually open a retail store, but it wasn't practical.
As you look back on it, there really was nothing practical to have done.
No, there wasn't.
Well, what happened then in '64? You closed the business. What?
Well, two things happened. My father died in 1964. March.
Oh, the business was still open when he passed away?
Yes, it was. Yes, and it was declining already at that time, and I had an offer in a completely unrelated field, which I eventually ended up with, and I decided to pull up stakes at that time, and I think we closed the business July 1st, 1964, which was about 3 months after my father died.
Was it pretty tough to close those doors the final time?
No, I was glad, because it became a it was a drag.
Where were you located at that point?
804, 806 Broadway.
Never
No.
changed the address. What was happening around you at that time? Were you noticing some of these other businesses already gone, or did they hold on a little while longer?
They held on a little. They held on a little while longer. Yeah, they did. They did.
Do you know if some of them changed in any way to survive?
I sort of lost touch with them, to tell you the truth about it. I was out of it, and I was in a different area, on a different stage in my life at that time, and I really didn't pay too much attention to what was happening.
Are there companies like this at all today, or is everything just so different today that...
There may be some wholesalers left in the country. There probably are. There's always, somewhere or another, there's always a need for something like that. Maybe not on any extensive scale, but depending on the area that you're in and your ability to find enough customers to service, it's possible.
Now, towards the end, were you still buying most of your products domestically?
Yes.
So you would have gone to what, New York or Columbus, Mississippi, or wherever
That's right.
to make those purchases?
Yeah.
So the big influx of foreign-made textiles was after you were...
Yeah, I think it was
business.
primarily after that. Yes. Yeah.
What would your father think about that if he were here today and realized there's so little domestic product available?
He probably couldn't have even fathomed it. I don't think he could have. He was a good businessman, but he did not have a lot of foresight, if that's the right term. He knew he knew how to sell, and he knew his customers, but he did not have the overall wherewithal to foresee, you know, the influx of foreign-made merchandise.
I kind of hear you saying that he was real good at today and tomorrow, but not so good at next month and next year. Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
What you're saying. Of course, a lot of people
Yeah.
are like that. What would he think about the fact that you have to go to these massive stores, Walmart, Supercenter, to buy clothes today? Could he even comprehend that? Do you
Probably
think?
not. Probably not. Although I did know at one time, I had met and actually did a very, very small amount of business with Sam Walton at one time when Walton had one or more, just I think one store in Bentonville, Arkansas. He and a fellow by the name of John Lindsay, who lived in Neosha, Walton had a plane at that time, and they'd fly into Kansas City and look around for merchandise. That was the beginning of the Walmarts.
So you sold them some merchandise?
Once or twice we did. It did not. They were sort of exploring in Kansas City, but Lindsay and I were good friends. The guy from Neosha, but Walton, I never, you know, he was sort of, even at that time, he was above us.
Did you meet him?
I did meet him one time. Yes, once I did. Once.
And you say at that time they just had the one big store?
I think that he had. Maybe it was either. I think it was in Bentonville, Arkansas. I think so. You know, this is going back, you know, already now almost 60 years ago for me.
You had no hint that he would become what he became?
He was just that he had a nice store and he was doing business, and that's all I knew.
Were you in the store?
No, I was never in his store. Never was.
So he was just another
Walk-in.
Store for you at that.
That's right.
At that time. I asked what your father would think about what's going on today with foreign clothing and all of these big stores. What do you think, as someone who's actually experienced all of that?
Well, it's made an unbelievable impact. I would like to have seen more domestic production as compared to all the foreign goods that's coming in here. But obviously, it fulfills a need. It's a lot cheaper, obviously, than in many instances than the domestic manufacturer can produce it, and that's the name of the game. It's what you can bring it in at a lower cost and market it retail wise.
So you don't particularly hate it then?
No, I don't hate it. It's just it's a fact of life. That's all.
Pretty sad that we can't get any of this stuff manufactured in the U.S. though.
Well,
The labor.
I don't think
cost.
that the cost of producing it here probably is excessive as compared to the cost of producing it and shipping it in.
To unions. Maybe.
Well, let me take a hint from Evelyn. Do you think the union influence has been good or
Well,
bad?
unions have a place in the life. Those guys have to be protected too. You can't let the manufacturers just run roughshod over their employees and work them 60 or 80 hours a week or something like that. There's a time and place for it. It's got to find itself in the market.
Mm-hmm.
But be that as it may, it's supply and demand.
You know, your company went out of business, you said, in '64.
That's right.
And the Kansas City garment industry, the manufacturing part of it, was already in some trouble at that point.
They succumbed to imports.
And then they went out of business some years later. Do you think about any of that when you go down to drive by 8th and Broadway?
Oh, sure I do, yeah. Yeah, I've
What
got a good friend of mine who we always sit and talk about it. A fellow who's he sold trimmings and various sundry things to the garment industry, and he still likes to talk about what happened down there. And it was primarily the demise came about from imported garments.
Do you feel bad at all when you drive down there and see your old building, or?
No, I don't feel bad. It's just a building. That's all. I
Nostalgia.
don't feel bad about it.
Not a lot of nostalgia.
No, no.
Do you think there needs to be more done in Kansas City to preserve the memories and the knowledge of the garment industry as a whole?
Well, if you ask Sybil, probably yes.
I'm asking you.
I think that there's a place for it because at one time the garment, the women's side of the garment industry in Kansas City was probably the second largest in the United States, next only to New York City. So there is something there that is worthy of historical significance. Yes, I do believe there is.
It doesn't seem to me that we've done a very good job of preserving the memories and.
There's nobody left to do it. Well, Harvey Freed is probably one of the ones who's more involved in it than anybody else is, and Harvey and I grew up together.
Who is he?
That was Harvey Freed. Was the Freed Siegel Company.
Oh. I forgot to ask you what you did after the business closed. What did you go into?
I became a vice president with the Mercantile Bank and Trust Company of Kansas City, which ultimately became U.S. Bank, and I stayed there until 1996, when I retired from there. And I've worked part-time for the last 15 years for the Bank of Blue Valley in Overland Park, Kansas, doing business development and public relations.
So you've been a banker then for the last part of your life?
Since 1964, yes.
Was that a difficult transition, or?
Somewhat, yeah, but it flowed.
Did you ever miss the garment business?
Not one bit. You don't miss something when the last few years you're suffering and seeing it go down. You just want out.
But it was a pretty good business for your father up until...
It was good business. Yeah, we all made a living out of it. Yeah, we did. We did until the last few years, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you've come to the end of my questions. And I think I probably squeezed you enough for one morning.
No, that's
so
all right.
why don't we...
I hope I answered them.
Why don't we cut off the tape there?
I hope.